Welcome to Preparing the Next Generation of Civic Science Leaders. As science advances and breaks down walls, it's essential to ensure that the breakthroughs can then be used to tackle society's great challenges. So this session will explore frameworks for preparing future civic science leaders. Pioneers and emerging leaders will discuss co-creating leadership approaches, aiming for a future where all people can shape and benefit from science. I also want to let you know right now that there are some extra info and resources with a QR code on them that'll be available right after this panel if you'd like. And my friend Jolana there is holding them up if you'd like to go in and chat with her afterward. And now I'd like to invite each of the panelists to the stage. I'm going to ask them to please come as one at a time as they hear their names. So first joining me are Dietram Schäufele, who is Taylor Bascom Chair in Science Communication and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thanks for joining, Dietram. Next, please welcome Francis Colin, who's Senior Director, International Climate Policy at the Center for American Progress. Thank you, Francis. And now please join me in welcoming Avriel C. Epps, who is a Civic Science Fellow at the Citizens and Technology Lab at Cornell University. Hello, Avriel. Next to join us on stage here is Narayan Sankaran, who is an Assistant Professor of Neuroscience at the University of San Francisco and also a Civic Science Fellow at the Kavli Center for Ethics, Science, and the Public at the University of California, Berkeley. Thanks, Narayan. Last and certainly not least, please welcome Nalini Saul, who's Director, Office of Career and Professional Development at the University of California, Berkeley. University of California, San Francisco. Oh, San Francisco, I'm sorry. The jet lag is real, Nalini. So University of California, San Francisco, please, and it does say that on my board. I appreciate that. As you can see, some of us from the East and West Coast here of the United States are a little jet lagged and also still thinking about things that have happened this week. Our panel will have a moderated discussion for about the next half hour or so, and after that we'll take questions from all of you in the audience, and pardon my backs, folks here. So as you listen, please think about the things you might like to ask our speakers today. And in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to give the speakers one final question to wrap us up on. So now, without further ado, Dietram, I'd like to start with you. Tell us a little bit about what civic science is and why it's especially important to help solve today's problems.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, everybody, for being here. It's great to be back in Germany, even though it's an interesting time, I understand, both from German politics and certainly for us in the U.S. Maybe a time where that's more important than ever before to think about civic science, changing fundamentally, as I would call it, the DNA of science and reorient it toward its civic responsibility and opportunity, I would say. And partly this is driven by an increasing fragmentation of society. That fragmentation sometimes plays out the way it's recently played out in the US, where we may see both chambers of government and the White House be controlled by one party, or the way it is in Germany, where different coalitions are breaking apart, forming, and people not looking forward necessarily to new elections that may bring out fringe parties even more. That makes it more and more important to connect with the communities that are most likely to benefit from science, especially, and I think this is the last point that I will add to this question, as science is moving into territory that is fundamentally challenging and changing what it means to be human. AI is just one example, KI in German. Human brain organoids, human-machine interfaces, new technologies that will push what's possible, but they will also push discussions of what we should be doing as society. And doing that as our societies are more divided than ever on values, I think makes that particularly an urgent challenge. So I'll leave it with that. I'm sure we'll do a deeper dive anyway.
Thanks a million, Dietram. And also here at Falling Walls, where we celebrate breakthroughs that push down walls, why is fostering the next generation of leaders in civic science especially an important topic?
Yeah, and in one of the previous sessions, somebody asked, is this just more of the same? Are we just living in a disruptive time and will return eventually to the same status quo that we've seen before? And I don't think that's the case. I think we're going into a world where communities are going to be increasingly divided, and I mean the term community broadly across values and other things. And the inability, a potential inability of the scientific community, or what sometimes is negatively portrayed by some political players as elites, to connect with those. And I've seen the same discussions in the aftermath of some German elections that I've seen in the US. The inability to meaningfully connect with groups that, based on values, on their very fundamental beliefs and how the world works, are different from us in the scientific community or in other communities. That inability spells trouble, and it spells trouble in profound ways, not just for our ability to do science, but for our ability as a society to take advantage of that science. So that's why I think those are, for me, the most urgent walls to work on, because that's of course the very idea of a democratic society, right? Talk across lines of difference and overcome those challenges.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that about crossing lines of difference. So Francis, you've worked in policy spaces, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that same question that I just asked Dietram, about why you think civic science is so important in this moment.
So thank you, Dietram, for framing the political environment that we're coming to this conference in. When I left government and when I was doing policy and started working at the local level, it was with the idea that the most progress that could be made in terms of moving science ahead as a tool that communities could use could only happen at the local level. And that was during the first Trump administration when I left government. Little did I know that, obviously, among the many challenges, a pandemic would hit at that moment. And I see civic science as, for me, the action of the responsibility I have as a scientist to democratize the tools of science for people. During that time, I took to the radio in the mornings. I am a Hispanic community member in the United States, and so getting on the radio every morning to talk about what was happening, what this virus was, what it was not, why using a mask was important for your community, for your family, helping people that were not working from home, service workers who were still going out to jobs and still making decisions for their families, and helping get the best scientific information out in a way that people could digest it and make decisions for themselves and their families in their own language. Hearing a scientist come on the radio and speak to them in their own language, in the frame in which they could understand it, why this mattered, why it was important. To me, that's civic science. It doesn't matter that I had all these titles before. If in the middle of a moment where having science help you make decisions, we don't have our scientists and our leaders out there in community, then why do we do this? So.
One quick follow-on about the local level and why it's so important, if you don't mind. Is it because it's more approachable with people you might know from your community, or shared values, or what are some of the reasons behind that? And then I have another quick question for you after that. Yeah.
I think, yes. I think I understand my community. I know what language works for them. I know who are the leaders in the community that they respect and they go to, that they trust. I know how they receive and take in information. And so tapping into all of those and putting on my science hat. I just did a 1-hour radio show last week on just climate in a very local radio station that talks about nothing scientific ever. And the response to that show, people asking very good questions, not underestimating your own community members, taking into account people's legitimate fears, legitimate frames, and being there. The most important thing is that I was there for an hour in that space, and they could ask anything, and I was there for them. I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. So building those trust relationships in community is so important. Now, I'd like to ask you a bit about the policy experience as well. What should policy leaders be thinking about in this moment?
I think that we can't leave the space, even if we're not in charge. I think we need to think about the advocacy tools, the community tools we have to work with. And we need to be present. We need to be present for our communities. There is going to be, in the United States, for example, a lot of additional misinformation. We need to be in the spaces. And policy leaders need to consider that people's needs, what people need from science, needs to be part of the decision-making process, not just what the pharmaceutical company wants its bottom line to be, or what do people actually need, and how do we influence that the science process takes into account what people in communities need.
So now we've heard a bit about, thank you so much, Frances. We've heard a bit about science taking a turn toward more of its civics responsibilities, especially as new technologies that sort of reshape our relationship with the world, like AI, with humanity's relationship with the world, are so critical, and how communities may be divided on value lines, and it's especially important to build those bridges, and that some of the ways we do that is we embed ourselves in those communities, and we take the time to speak to them in the ways that they understand and know about issues they care about. So I'd like to now turn to, now you've sort of heard the broad umbrella strokes of civic science, and I think it would really help you to learn about a couple of terrific projects by current civic science fellows. And Avril, I hope you don't mind me start with you. Tell us about your civic science fellowship projects, and what are you doing and how is it going?
Yeah, thank you so much. So one of the questions that I and many others in my communities had after the Hamas attacks of October 7th and then the Israeli attacks in Gaza preceding or after that was, what is the role that algorithms, particularly on social media, but also those that feed content to us on other platforms, how do they play into the kind of falling out that we saw across communities that are historically aligned on the left, particularly Black communities and Jewish communities who consider themselves to be historical allies? And so I was approached by a community partner who had interest in facilitating a year-long process of conducting intergroup dialogues across community leaders in Los Angeles of those two groups to try to get a sense of what does solidarity mean now in 2024 for these communities, and how can we rebuild that, especially ahead of the election. And one of the questions I brought to them was, well, are you considering the role that the algorithms have to play in this, both in shaping human behavior and human psychology, but then also how this in real life intervention might shape the algorithmic results that we can observe? So that is essentially kind of the basis of the project, and we're researching this with a really robust multi-methods approach, deep ethnographic work, being in those dialogues with folks every single month, and conducting interviews with them, longitudinal surveys, and then hopefully, if we're lucky and people still trust us at the end of this year-long process, asking them to donate their data from the platforms that they're consuming media on, so we can analyze the patterns of what's going on there and how that may have or may have not shifted over the time that they were involved in this program.
Tell us a little bit more about how that's working with the communities. How's that changed your science? And maybe a little bit about some of the initial things you're sensing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I came into this process knowing that building trust in both of these communities was going to be incredibly important. Although I am both Black and Jewish, I can't just parachute into a space and think that I'm automatically going to be trusted by those communities. And so getting to know them and being embedded in the actual program that they're involved in has been incredibly important. And also taking their feedback seriously. So when surveys go out and they're like, hey, I don't understand this question, or this is not the way I would have particularly measured this, taking that into consideration and going back to the literature and figuring out if it makes sense to make tweaks to those questions. At first people were really skeptical, especially, I think maybe the better word is afraid of being really open with their views about what is happening in Israel and Palestine at the beginning of this project, and probably would not have been willing to donate all of their data of what it is they've been consuming and liking and commenting on and things like that all over social media for fear of retribution. But I think now the time that we've invested in really becoming community members and being with each other on this ride has allowed them to trust us and provide that data for us.
Yeah, and give you just a little bit more about some of the techniques you've used to become part of the communities. Is it time? Are there some other attributes that you've found useful in your science with them?
Yeah, I think time is a big thing, moving at the speed of trust, as Adrienne Marie Brown says. And not coming in assuming that they would allow us to do the methods that we wanted to do right at the gate, being responsive to their feedback, and being honest when we can't take their feedback into consideration and change things the way that they're asking for, and explaining that to them, holding research office hours, and really making myself available to be transparent about how science happens, what questions we're going to be able to answer, what questions we aren't going to be able to answer, the limitations of the methods, et cetera, as we go along.
I love that expression, moving at the speed of trust. I think it's a great internal governor to have. And I love the ideas of transparency. And even, I didn't know about the office hours. I think that's a terrific idea, so people can, in an ongoing way, interact with you. So thanks a lot, Avriel, for sharing some of that with us. And Narayan, same thing. I'd love to hear about your Civic Science Fellowship project. Tell us a bit about what you're doing and how it's going.
Sure. Thanks, Mary.
And maybe some framing, too, about neuroethics issues, because I think that's the top line for you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my civic science project relates to the fact that as a neuroscientist who studies the human brain, I'm seeing my field really kind of reach this inflection point where we're starting to crack the neural code, so to speak. And what I mean by that is we're gaining this fundamental understanding of how the brain, at a physical level, like the level of neurons, is able to enable our thoughts, our emotions, all of the kind of internal dimensions that we think of when we think of our rich internal mental life. And so because we're cracking the neural code in this way, we're enabling the development of brain interfacing technologies, I think Dietra mentioned this earlier, that are able to read information from the brain. So for example, researchers can record human brain activity, and using AI, we can translate that brain activity directly into speech corresponding to what the person was thinking. Similarly, we can also decode a person's emotional states, their imagined movements, and all other forms of internal dimensions directly from their brain activity in real time. And so this is just a very fundamentally novel form of technology. And I'm interested in how, as a society, we ought to think about using these new technical capabilities. But I don't think that question can be answered by the scientific community alone. I think, people are experts in their own lives. They have, diverse needs and desires and prior experiences and hobbies. And so neuroscientists alone aren't going to know how neuroscientific advances can best shape people's lives. And so for my civic science project, it's about really creating spaces, including physical, literal spaces in Berkeley, California, in and around the city, where neuroscientists and the public can convene and share their opinions about how they see these technologies fulfilling needs in their lives and more broadly in society. I think a real challenge I've faced in doing this work is obviously the public is not a monolith, and in this case specifically, it's quite a complicated ethical picture because the who that you're engaging with specifically really matters a lot because this line of research and these technologies really evoke some ethically different reactions depending on the lens through which you view the research. So on one hand, these brain interfacing technologies have really compelling clinical uses that have the potential to improve well-being. So for example, if someone has vocal paralysis, being able to read their brain activity and translate it to speech can restore their communication. Or for someone with major depressive disorder, we can stimulate the brain in specific ways and alleviate depressive symptoms. So, there are these positive responses we see when people are viewing the research through this lens of their clinical use. But at the same time, the idea that, we have a device interacting algorithmically with the organ that houses the human mind, that really elicits some deep concern in people as well, and we see this. So people have concerns that their mental privacy is going to be eroded, or that in pursuing these brain interfacing technologies, we're really losing some of our individual autonomy and agency, the ability to think and act freely. So it's complicated, and because we have these ethically disparate reactions, we have to be really mindful of who in the public we're engaging with when we do this. So that's been challenging in designing the project. I think it'll continue to be challenging. And my approach is, I think as neuroscientists, we need to be exposed and interacting with the full breadth of perspectives that exist in the public in order to ensure that these neuroscientific advances can fulfill the needs of society as a whole. Yeah.
It's really terrific to hear about the different dimensions of communities. And one of the things we talked about is how you think that interacting them will shape your science. You've just talked about why that's important to do, because maybe science alone doesn't understand everything there is to know about how to implement in society, or whether or when. But what are some of the things you're thinking about as the communities and you interact with the research areas?
Yeah, I think, creating spaces where the public and scientists can interact in a meaningful way is bound to change scientific practice, at least as it currently stands. And I think it'll change it for the better. I think for me personally, this work has been really instrumental in reminding myself that my science and my scientific community, our advances, they don't belong to us. And so questions about how to responsibly use those advances, or even questions about what research questions we should pursue in the first place, that really has to result from a process of scientists going out into their community and playing an active role within them.
I really love that expression that you just said, that scientific advances don't just belong to the scientists who work on them, and that's certainly something to really reflect on and think about. I think when we consider, and thank you so much, Narayan, appreciate it. I think when we consider the future of developing tomorrow's civic science leaders, Nalini, you do amazing work in the education spaces. And I think we're getting some hints here about what are some of the differences about training for civic science compared with, science communication, which people often confuse it with.
Certainly. So I lead a team at the University of California, San Francisco, and I head an Office of Career and Professional Development. So we wake up every single day and we think about what skills do scientists need to basically not only sort of understand their career options, but how to position themselves to be successful in those career paths. And so when you think about science communication, you are really thinking about how to make science understandable. So you're thinking about skills that help educate the public and engage the public about science. When you think, on the other hand, about civic science, and I'm sure I'm saying nothing new to the people at this table, we're really thinking about the key role that science plays in actually solving some of the most pressing issues that we have today. And so when you try to think about those needs, and then you sort of try to think about how to position and think about what career or what skills and knowledge do scientists need, you're really thinking about things like, on science communication, just things like, well, what does it mean to communicate effectively? How do you communicate in different platforms? How do you basically sort of engage and be considered a trustworthy source of communication? As well as, what does it mean to communicate effectively on speaking, presenting, writing? So it's just really thinking about, how do you basically engage? Civic science, of which science communication is a piece, really helps you start to think about skills that help people sort of use their knowledge and skills to do good work. Right? So you're thinking about things like how to make sure that scientists understand how policy is formed, how government works, giving them opportunities to figure out how to shape how to shape policy, how to shape their communities, as well as understanding not just what kind of jobs are available, but what careers are available for people who wish to do this good work. So it's really, they're related, but a little different.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Oh,
all right.
Thank you.
We got some
All
applause.
right, got the
Amazing.
audience.
Thanks a million. But, thinking, let's think a little bit broader. I mean, we're pioneering a whole new field here and a whole new type of career path. How should we start to think about that? There are a lot of elements to that.
Right. So I think you can kind of think of it as sort of two sides. There's what's going on for the individual scientist, and who is civic-minded, and what do they need to know about different options and how to position themselves for those options and how to succeed when they're in those opportunities. And then there are organizations, like many of the organizations that people here are a part of, where they might benefit from having a civic-minded scientist, and the question is, what things do they need to do to both recognize and find those scientists and recruit them and help them succeed in those organizations? So there are a wide range of skills that, or sort of things that need to happen for those connections to happen. And one of the things I think with any new sort of field is that there's a lack of awareness about there being an opportunity, about what that opportunity looks like, about what you need to do to position yourself from an individual scientist just thinking about that work. And then from an organizational standpoint, there's a question about, how do you even source those scientists who are interested in that? Where do you recruit? How do you actually even signal to scientists that this is a place where a civic-minded scientist is considered a benefit? And then finally, if you invite those individuals into your community, how do you change your organization to make space for them to bring those thoughts to the table? And so there's this entire kind of sort of, I don't want to call it a pipeline, but there are places where I think we can think intentionally about how to really expose scientists to this great work, and then to help them understand that there are great things they can do in their careers. And that's one of the wonderful things I think about the Rita Allen Civic Science Fellows, which is that it just gives the scientists time and space to learn those skills and to understand those options and to really think about how their work can do greater good.
Thank you. That's terrific. So we've heard about what civic science is, why it's so important in the moment now, how we can make connections most valued at the local level, how science, we don't own it ourselves necessarily if we're in the research spaces, and ways that we can work with others to maximize the benefits for everybody. I hope you've been thinking about these issues as we've gone along, and that maybe you have some questions you'd like to share over the next 10 minutes or so. And I see this gentleman in the front row. Is there a microphone that's running around that we could use? There we are. Thanks a million. Thanks, Aaron. And when you stand up, maybe quick who you are.
Is this on? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Aaron Mertz. I'm the founder and executive director of the Aspen Institute Science and Society program. Amid this growing field of civic science, my question for Naledi and for Dietram is, how do you see people positioning their civic science work in a way that traditional university departments will value those contributions alongside their usual metrics for hiring, tenure, promotion?
Great question.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, please, you first.
I'll take a first stab, and then you can give the real answer.
I'll try.
I think it's a great question, Aaron. I think it's probably one of the most pressing questions given for folks at least working within academia who live up to the same success metrics or have to live up to very traditional success metrics of grants, of other things. I think there's some interesting or some really exciting changes that already have taken place, and this was prior to the civic science movement, certainly in the US, where universities have started to rethink how can we actually platform activities that connect meaningfully with the kinds of communities that we have tried to help and work with for a long time. And I think help is already the wrong word here, because civic science really asks for a fundamental reorientation, not as academia helps, but academia moves out of two things. One, out of its physical spaces, its ivory tower, physical and intellectual spaces, and moves into the spaces where those communities are, number one. I think a second one, and that's just the more difficult one, is we need to move out of our own comfort zones, right? We all have communities who we like to work with, but the most urgent and pressing challenges, and this is, I think, again, I'm going to come back to the two forthcoming elections in Germany and the recent elections in the US that have showcased really powerfully the groups we have had the worst track record in having meaningful civic engagement with are the groups that we most strongly disagree with in terms of values, who we maybe sometimes have visceral reactions to, what they stand for, what they think about. But that's why we're not having that conversation. So how do we build that infrastructure? Partly it is about incentives and helping people to do that, allowing people to get academic credit for it. And again, I think there are models for what are in some universities called an integrated tenure case. So where as people go up in the US, we have what in German would be Verbeamtung. Tenure for us means you go through a bunch of processes and eventually you have permanent employment. In order to get there, you can now produce materials that show that your research excellence is partly, that level or that standard of research excellence is partly met by work with and in collaborations with communities. Urbana-Champaign has one, Wisconsin, we have one of those, and I know tons of other universities are moving in that direction. I think the much more difficult, or maybe the second difficult part, I shouldn't say much more difficult, is the career pathway. And if you look around the table, I think all of us have very different pathways toward where we are, and none of us were in kindergarten or in elementary school and said, I want to be a civic scientist at some point, right? And nobody, and in this room, also probably nobody said, I want to be at Falling Walls at some point. It's a way of thinking very outside of what traditional modes of thinking of moving forward is. So the second challenge is, and I think this is where the coalition of funders that form the Civic Science Network, really this very broad coalition of different funders, of different partner and host partners, of groups from very different backgrounds that pursue this is so exciting because it models for the universities what could be possible if they start to rethink the status quo. And so I think that's where the power of philanthropy is, to kind of think about a world that could be rather than changing the world that currently is. And I think that's where I think the most promising pathway forward. Great question. And
right.
Annalidi is going to really give you an answer.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, I realize that I come from a perspective of really just thinking about of working with scientists who are really thinking about their career paths, right? And one of the things that they have told me, not everyone, but many of them have really struggled with even articulating an interest in doing this type of work, in understanding and having the vocabulary to articulate sort of like what this career path would look like, and in some cases perhaps not getting the support from their PI, from their organization, to even consider a path that might not be at the bench, Research One institution, that type of goal. And yet I can say, I think like Dietram is saying, that I'm heartened by a number of changes. One, the number of organizations like yours and initiatives where that these career paths are highlighted, this work is highlighted, because that's that first step, right? You have to have recognition. And so I think about sort of 20 years ago, which is when I helped establish the office at UCSF, where there was really no understanding about any career path. There was kind of academe or darkness. These were your two choices. Pick accordingly. And so it has been amazing to me because now in my world there are people who we can point to, right? There are communities of people doing good work. It's being highlighted at organizations like this. So there's an understanding that this is possible. What isn't there yet is an understanding of what that career path looks like, right? Because it is so varied. But I think that this part of the strategy is in helping individuals understand how to build out their whole careers, their own careers, right? Like how do you want to basically engage with integrity in your work? And sometimes that means directly going into a position, but in some cases it means that in your organization, wherever you are, how can you engage from a civic-minded perspective, right? How can you volunteer and speak to your community about some of the most pressing topics? So I'm still heartened by all of the amazing work that is happening, because I think that once scientists are smart, once you guys understand that this is possible, then it's just a question about how do you help position them to do this good work.
Thank you. Awesome. I see another hand back here, and I also want to look behind me. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for your contributions. Very interesting. I couldn't agree more that recognition really matters. And, by the way, Balzhano Razbaeva manages strategic initiatives at UIIN. We work with universities and researchers across the globe, helping them develop impactful careers. But we talk about most of the impact, and I really like the perspective of civic science. And one of the questions that I'm personally puzzled with is how can I support researchers better in the work that they do?
Great.
So, and this is how I started. I think recognition is very important, and I'm also very heartened to see that there is a lot of recognition everywhere. But the question that I have to the panelists, how can we better support them? So what kind of skills, perhaps competencies, we can help them develop so that they are seen and so that they, I guess, have a better pathway to then, going to those organizations. So if we can talk a little bit more about training or capacity building, I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
With that, would somebody like to start?
I can jump in really quickly. I think that I would say there are three different areas. One is this, and one of the exciting parts about the Civic Science Fellow Program in particular, and the fellows can speak to that as well, is the idea that it is also a learning community, and a learning community that is not a top-down learning community, but one where, again, the different partners, funders, host partners, fellows, learn from each other over time. And so I think it's a pretty unusual model, but it's an exciting, because it is unusual, it's an exciting one. I think there are also grassroots models that we've seen pop up. In the US, we have ComSciCon and others. So graduate students being frustrated with a lack of training, almost getting together and trying to build capacity. And in many ways, the Civic Science Fellows Program was a response to that. How can we actually empower that, amplify that? So the grassroots models, I think, are great, but they're more as an indicator of a problem than they are a long-term sustainable solution. And then number three, I would mention programs that are increasingly available, and I'm aware of fewer in Europe and in Germany than I'm in the US. But one of the fastest growing programs in my department, and I'm in a department of communication within a STEM, a science, technology, engineering, math department, and we have both a PhD minor and a graduate certificate in science communication, broadly construed, that touches on many of the elements of civic science, engagement, research practice partnerships, working with communities. And the reason it's one of the fastest growing programs is because a lot of students who are PhDs in genetics, who are PhDs in neuroscience, who are PhDs in other fields, want to have transcriptable expertise, where they're saying, not only do I want to have the expertise on how to do this better when I run my own lab at MIT, or I was about to say Berkeley and pointed you. UC San Francisco.
Happens a lot.
Sorry, I did that.
Berkeley.
I did that.
This is all Marriott.
It's okay, we're all UC. We love it.
But when they run their own labs, but they may also go into very different careers, right? They may work in philanthropy. They may make impacts as directors of museums and so on. And so I think that the exciting part about both those formalized training efforts in the Civic Science Fellow Program is that it prepares folks for leadership positions across different sectors in society. So 10 years, 15 years from now, when we have another disruptive moment like this, these leaders will call each other and say, hey, remember we were in this fellow program together. How do we make change now when it's so urgently needed?
Right. And I also think, and I would love to hear a little bit about some of the competency development, because I think that the Rita Allen Foundation has done such a beautiful job of really thinking intentionally about those competencies. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But I can say that, in short, it sort of feels like two things for me. One is resource. It's money. money, right? So there's money, and then there's sort of space. So the money has to do with helping people have funding to even engage in these activities. So the difference between a paid and an unpaid internship, the difference between a fellowship and given sort of true space to actually do this work deeply. Those are some of the, I mean, it's crass, but money. And then there's the second piece about really giving space. So how is it part of training? How does it part of, how is it visible on campus and celebrated when scientists actually engage in this work? For example, at my institution and many institutions, there's an intentionality around teaching ethics training and the responsible conduct of research. There could also be an intentionality between having courses that focus on skill development around being a civic scientist, right? What does it mean to engage with integrity and to use your skills to help the broader community? That isn't yet embedded into our training yet. And unfortunately, what that means is that for, going back to, I think, Erin's earlier question, or whoever was asking it, that means that, to be fair, for some faculty, for some administrations, or for some institutions, there's just a concern that that work is somewhat invisible. Right, so back at my institution, we had a fellowship, or we had an internship program through the NIH BEST grant. And one of the concerns was that if the scientists weren't in the lab, then that work wasn't getting done. There wasn't productivity. And so one of the things that some of my amazing colleagues did is they tracked it to see if there was any increase in time to degree if a person did an internship, and the answer was no. But that also means that faculty probably got support about how to really sort of offboard and help scientists onboard again if they actually did that work. And so there's kind of support at every single stage to help make this possible. And so it is my hope that that all these best practices about these programs, formal training, degrees, and also just trainings, and all the communities will actually, that visibility will be raised so people will understand that there's so many different ways to make this happen. And the question is, which one works for you in your situation?
Yeah.
So I think we might have time to do one last, sorry, Avril. I think we have time to take one last question if we do it quickly, believe it or not, because these panels fly by like lightning. I saw another hand up over here, and I want to give you a chance. And if we answer quickly, I think we can fit this in. You might have to push the button up. No?
Test. Okay. My name is Nadine Knab. I'm a postdoc in social psychology and the head of the German Peace Psychology Organization. So I'm also inherently interested how we can use science to impact conflict and peace processes. And my question is specifically targeted towards the policy impact of research, because I feel like there are a lot of structures that allows research and practice collaborations, but the actual question is how can we impact policy? So I wonder if you have any anecdotes and what way your projects have been an impact on policy, or maybe from your colleagues, doesn't have to be like from your projects. Or maybe you say that actually the policy impact is not the main focus. I think we should focus on supporting communities, and they should in the end impact policy.
They're all looking at me.
Sorry, Francis.
No, it's okay. I want to also look at you while I answer, but I'm gonna try to be halfway. Yeah. I think that, at least in the U.S., we have been working on this question of bridging science and policy for a long time to make it effective. And I think there's a number of success stories. But I think one of the clear ones for me is how over time, the value of having scientists involved in the policy process became very clear. When I did a fellowship years ago and I went directly for my PhD into a policy fellowship. That program started in the 70s with 7 people. That program today puts over 250 scientists into our legislative executive branch, and now even into the judicial branch. They work with judges and many other people. And the fact that the take-up of those scientists has grown over time has been very indicative. And so I'm not going to speak to specific policy, but I think it's been that process over time delivering results for helping decision makers use the best available science to these actors. I want to say in graduate schools across the country in the US, we're seeing more and more graduate students demand more of those programs where they can interact directly with policymakers and legislators. And so what maybe Nalini was saying, which was more voluntary and organic, now universities are having to create the spaces and really be intentional about it because there's demand from both sides.
Thanks so much. So lightning round, folks, because believe it or not, we only have 3 minutes 54 before the end of this panel. I know you've all been thinking about this, and we certainly touched on it. I want to ask everybody, what is the next step we have to take to break down the wall of preparing the next generation of civic science leaders? Can we go quick loop around?
Sure. I'll pick up on Nadine's question because I think it's relevant. I think we're at a time where our most important job is to connect again with groups that seem more and more, or that feel like they're more and more disconnected for us. So I think if I would put a challenge in front of everybody, I would say if you're from Germany and you're doing civic science, you're moving outside of the ivory tower, both mentally and in working with communities, unless you're meaningfully able to speak to a group like the AfD, Alternative for Germany, right? I know there's going to be mental pushback. A lot of you are like, oh, really? But unless we're able to engage in some of the questions that groups raise who see themselves really far removed from where we are, we're not civic. Civic means an ability to meaningfully connect with everybody who is in good faith trying to move things forward. And again, that's maybe a broader, maybe a very narrow definition. In the US, exactly the same thing. Franz Kafka at some point said you should only read books that pinch and bite you, Bücher lesen, die anbeißen und stechen. And I think that's exactly it. Us listening to viewpoints and engaging with viewpoints that are different from ourselves. That's very civic. Sorry for...
Thank you. I'm being uncivic. Francis, 30 seconds.
I would challenge everybody in the room to think about what dedicating 10% of the time of the things you're already doing to think about it intentionally in terms of civic science. For me, that means getting on the radio in the mornings, maybe once a week. It means in the US, knocking doors for a candidate in local office that is pushing for resilience measures for our city that gets flooded every week. So, but those are my platforms, the ways I interact. How do you? What is at your fingertips? What platforms can you use? What are your networks or your communities? How could you use 10%?
Thank you, Francis. Avril.
Yeah. Civic science for me is very slow, complicated, messy work, and I think that often is in tension with the expectations of academia. And so I would ask folks to rework their expectations of what meaningful science could look like and the pace that it could move at. And I think it takes all of us to really push back against that frenetic pace that is often pushed on us in academia.
I love that. Thank you. Narayan.
So I would say for the scientists in the room, seek out someone that views your field of research in a completely different way and just practice sitting with them and truly just listening and engaging with them and trying to find the root cause that shapes their perspective.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I would say for organizations that basically have things like professional development funding, think about actually inviting your communities to actually engage in this work and finding ways to support scientists actually doing this work, as well as if you can invite somebody to come and do an hour-long session on how to give feedback, you can invite someone from the community to come and actually sort of talk about the impact of your work. And so this piece about, once again, recognition and raising awareness, that's huge.
Thank you so much. So there you have it, Civic Science, a world where we all get to shape and benefit from the products of science. I hope you'll join me in thanking our wonderful speakers. It was a great conversation and really enjoyed it.